What's up, guys? Today I wanted to talk a little bit about balance changes. We already know there's some upcoming, but they haven't been announced yet. Today I wanted to just talk about what I think should happen to some cards in the standard right now to bring them more in line with the rest of the set. So without further ado, here are my suggested balance changes. Jokes aside, if you wanted to actually balance the cards without completely removing them, here's what I do. Starting with the number one offender, I'd say, which is Luna's Pocket Galaxy. Personally, I think this is a card that actually should be Hall of Famed, potentially. I don't think it's very healthy for the state of the game. It kind of creates games where you don't really feel like you have much control. Oftentimes, they're going to be top decking two powerful things for you to stay ahead in tempo. If they were to balance it, I would actually revert it back to its 7 mana cost that it had before. Since it was that 7 mana, the card has got better in the sense that there's more payoff to it, I think. They released cards like the 8 mana 5/5 that cast a spell from your deck, as well as like the King Faris, as well as the Reno cards, which actually make Luna's Pocket Galaxy itself a much stronger card in the context of its deck. Before, it was strong with the Giants and Antonidas, but that was about it, really. Now the payoff is much, much larger. So even at 7 mana, you could see the card seeing fringe play as kind of like a tech card for certain matchups like Warrior, where you really want to get a huge tempo advantage, and you're not so worried about spending a turn kind of doing nothing to do so. A lot of people might suggest making it 6 mana, but I think that makes it still too strong of a card. Like I said, the payoff's still too high, and I think the card itself shouldn't be competitively viable. It doesn't make for skillful or fun interactive experiences, if that's a bit of a meme. It just means that games are going to be decided based off your top decks of whether you can play Lunas on curve, and there's just going to be too many games where you feel like you can't actually do anything to influence the outcome of the game, and that doesn't make for good Hearthstone. Next up, we can talk about the Dr. Boom package, because it's very intertwined. There's a lot of ingredients into what makes mech warriors really strong right now. The primary offender would be Dr. Boom, but there's also a myriad of multiple cards which are making Dr. Boom a little bit too strong. Let's talk about the early game. First up, Warrior has access to 2 of the strongest 1-drops in Standard, and these 1-drops are strong throughout the course of the game. There's really no turn where you play these where you're a bit sad. Like in the mid game, with Eternium Rover, you can combo it with Warpath to gain extra life. Once you've played Boom, it's really a strong card as well. The same thing sort of goes for Town Crier. It's like a card that is really good on turn 1, as it sets up your mid game, but like on turn 5 or 6, it's still a good card because it's going to be drawing you that rush minion, which is always good in the mid game. So there's not really a turn ever in the game, except for the super late game when you've already drawn your rushes, that you're upset playing Town Crier. So that's a big problem for Warrior right now, is that they have 2 strong 1-drops. The same goes for a new 2-drop that they printed for them, Frightened Flunky. That card is just good at every stage of the game. It's just a better Stonehill defender, and Stonehill Defender was one of the most powerful cards in Standard for its time. So it's a little bit confusing why they boosted Warrior's power level this set when it was already being complained about before. The reason that Warrior's allowed to not run any sort of late game minions for the most part is Dr. Boom. Because the value that Dr. Boom provides and the tempo that Dr. Boom provides is so great that even playing mid-game size minions in the late game is enough to pull you ahead. So they can lower their curve, which they have done, to such an extent that they don't lose out on their early game, but their early game transitions into a late game because of the effects of Dr. Boom. So if you nerf Dr. Boom Mad Genius, in theory, or if you even rotate it or something like that, in theory, the rest of the warrior will get weaker and they'll be forced to put in late game options to try and outvalue opponents, because right now they're pretty much solely reliant on Omega Assembly and Dr. Boom, really. So as for a suggested change for it, I think it is just best to do something about Dr. Boom Mad Genius. He will just make the overall state of warrior itself a lot worse, and any other sort of problem cards like Omega Devastator, that sort of thing, will seem like they're not so bad anymore if they don't all have rush and stuff. So my suggested change for Dr. Boom, there's a few of them. One thing you could look at is removing the armor gain from Dr. Boom, or changing some of the hero powers. If you remove the armor gain that they initially get, it becomes suddenly a lot less safe to just play Dr. Boom on curve or Dr. Boom on 8. You can't shield slam with it, which is a huge tempo tool that they use with Dr. Boom, and is honestly one of the reasons why they can safely do it. Right now, against like an aggro deck, 7 health is pretty much a Frost Nova when you play Dr. Boom. So when you do play him, it's like you're not really losing anything onto the board. You're effectively freezing the board whilst you're playing your hero card, because you're not going to be taking too much damage from doing so. If you remove the armor gain that you get initially from Dr. Boom, they're not going to be able to Dr. Boom shield slam you. They're going to be dying a lot more on the follow-up turns, because they're not actually that likely to hit Blast Shield. If you have a burn damage deck, it can be a lot riskier to actually play Dr. Boom, because you lose out on that warrior hero power. This kind of makes Dr. Boom just worse against aggro decks, but it doesn't really change how it does against other control decks, that sort of thing, which might not be the change that people want with the card. A lot of times people complain because they're making a cool deck, but they just can't outvalue Dr. Boom in the late game. And this change isn't really going to help that. Changing the mana cost of Dr. Boom is probably something the developers don't want, because the original Dr. Boom cost 7, so this being a 7 cost hero which gains you 7 armor is a bit of a tongue-in-cheek joke, really. Something else you could do is change how the rush interacts. Like, you could give Battlecry, give all mechs in your hand rush, for instance. That means you can't Dr. Boom on 7 and then Omega Assembly later on and expect them to have rush. This is quite a nice change. I mean, you're still going to get rush on any mechs you have in hand, and oftentimes there is a bunch, like Devastators, etc. Still going to have rush. But it just means that the long-term value of Dr. Boom goes down. You might also have to change the microbots to actually make sure they do have rush on the hero power as part of the intrinsic hero power. I kind of like this change, to be honest. I think one of the big strength of Dr. Boom really is that giving everything rush. It just feels so frustrating once they have Boom, because you can put any minion down, if it's like a giant or something, and you're like, well, it's not going to stick, and you're effectively just throwing stuff onto the board, and if you throw too much onto the board, you're going to get AoE'd. If you throw too little onto the board, the mechs are just going to clear it up with value trades so easily. Another change you could do towards the Dr. Boom package is change Omega Devastator. Some people suggest maybe you can make it not a mech, so you can't discover it anymore. That seems like an okay change. I think one of the problems with Omega Devastator is its interaction with Ziliax. Oftentimes you can deal with getting devastated on 10. What you can't deal with is getting devastated plus Ziliax on 10, because it effectively kills your 2 largest minions on board, and it renos up the Dr. Boom to full health, which is way too strong of a turn 10 play, I think. But there's a few suggested changes for that. Number 1 is upping the cost of a Mega Devastator to something like a 6 mana 5/5. That will mean that it's still very strong on turn 10, but you can't combo it with Ziliax. All in all, Warrior's package really does stem from Dr. Boom. So if you change Dr. Boom, the rest of it probably won't feel as oppressive. But there are still a few things which are a bit too strong, like the early game and a Mega Devastator. that might need a little bit of adjustment as well. Finally, for Warrior, I think maybe that Brawl should be a candidate for getting Hall of Fame. It's kind of been in the game for far too long as a staple of the meta game, and if you think about the card, it is pretty unfun to play against. It creates some moments where you're hoping when stuff go into the Brawl, but it just becomes a lot frustrating when you have to play into it, and oftentimes they'll play a minion and Brawl, and if their minion wins the Brawl, well, you can't win that game. It just decides the game. If your biggest thing wins the Brawl, if you have like a giant on board, and some other tokens that you had to play somewhere along the line, and they Brawl, and your giant wins the Brawl, well, you win that game, and there's nothing the Warrior can do about it. And it kind of makes a frustrating gameplay experience for both players, I would say. As an experience that people have had for such a long time that I think it's probably time for a change, and that card probably should get Hall of Famed and replaced with other AoE options going forward, like the Plague of Wrath that they have right now is a less frustrating experience, I would say. Next up, maybe a little bit controversial, but I think Ziliax itself needs a bit of a nerf. Actually, looking at HS Replay, it's in 55% of decks, which is far too many. Same thing goes with Snip Snap, but that's only in a third of decks. And they're often intertwined because of the synergy they have together. Ziliax itself, I think, is too strong of a card. People say it's not oppressive, but if you're playing an aggressive deck, whether or not they have Ziliax pretty much determines the game a lot of the time. To me, I would just suggest one of two things. Either making Ziliax have 1 health rather than 2, which is going to make it a lot easier to deal with. Being able to just kill it with a ping and a 1/1 is way better, as well as being able to more easily get through a magnetized Ziliax minion as well. The other suggestion that I would make, if that is not enough, would just to make him 6 mana. It'd still be a pretty strong card at 6 mana. Kind of comparable to Argent Commander. Obviously, the Taunt and the Lifesteal compensate for the attack and if the ability to go face. I think Ziliax as a defensive tool is just way too strong right now. I kind of feel like this change won't actually happen. Even though Ziliax is played unanimously, I don't think Blizzard think it's a problem card. I think they're fine with all these decks having a neutral healing option like Ziliax. Next up, Priest. Priest, whenever a tempo style of Priest gets strong, Northshire Cleric becomes a problem. It's always happened. It's always been the #1 drawn, #1 mulligan win rate in any sort of tempo style Priest deck, and it is just far too strong for a 1-drop, and it always has been. Just whether or not the rest of the Priest can support it, and currently right now, Priest can support it massively. In Standard right now, Priest has access to probably the strongest early game package available in Northshire Cleric into Extra Arms or Injured Tolvir, as well as all the healing up bullshit stuff you see as well. And Priest snowballs so hard from having board control. So if they get this board control early, and there's not much you can do about it because they have an overpowered 1-drop, you're just going to lose those games a lot of the time, and it feels like you're never going to be able to get onto board or do anything. And it pretty much all stems from Northshire Cleric costing 1 mana. I think Northshire Cleric is well overdue for a nerf. It should probably cost 2, and it should have probably costed 2 like years ago. This also kind of goes in line with their design philosophy going forward. One of the weaknesses they have of Priest listed was card draw, which is frankly laughable right now since they're probably the most efficient at drawing cards with the Cleric Wild Pyro circle combos that you see. So yeah, nerf Cleric. It's like the last 1-drop left in Standard, which is obviously overpowered. If they can do it to Mana Worm, they can do it to Cleric. In terms of Divine Spirit, I don't think the card's too strong. It's a bit oppressive with Amit. And Blizzard themselves talked about thinking about Hall of Faming Divine Spirit in the future because they don't want priests to be reliant on the inner fire combos, which is fine in a design sort of aspect. But I don't think the card is too strong. If you nerf Cleric, the rest of the deck will fall into line, I think. So I don't think you actually need to change this card. Just nerf Cleric. That's all you gotta do. Next up, Mountain Giant. This is a bit of a problem card because of Conjurer's Calling. I think if Conjurer's Calling didn't affect... If there weren't ways to cheat out mana cost, Conjurer's Calling wouldn't be a problem card. It's pretty much just Giant as the main offender for this. Obviously Luna's Pocket Galaxy as well, but if that card sees change, then you won't have to change Conjurer's Calling as well. If Conjurer's Calling just worked normally as you would expect it to, I think it'd just be a fine card. Powerful, but not oppressively strong. The problem really stems from mana reduced things getting evolved for their original mana cost rather than their cheapened one. So one of the things you could do is, if you played a 4 mana giant, it would evolve into 4-cost cards. This might be like a bit of a headache on their end in terms of coding. They might have to do a bunch to change that, so there might be a change that isn't really viable, even if it theoretically sounds rather like elegant in a way, that it would just be a nice fix for all the problems with the cards. So as for another change for Mountain Giant is to Hall of Fame it. It's been a staple of Hearthstone for a long time. It's not really been in too many decks, but when it's been in those decks, it's been super strong. If you look at Evenlock, it was the strongest card in Evenlock, pretty much the reason why you played Evenlock. If you look at Conjurer's Mage, it's one of the strongest cards in that. And Handlock back in the day, it was very strong, but not oppressive back then. But there weren't these ways to cheat it out super cheaply, and there weren't ways to abuse its mana cost. So it might just make everyone's lives a bit easier if they Hall of Fame Mountain Giant instead of messing around with the code, messing around with interactions, making things perhaps not intuitive to some players. And if you're Hall of Faming Mountain Giant, maybe you should Hall of Fame Sea Giant, because it's just the last giant left in Standard then. You already got rid of Molten Giant years ago. If you're getting rid of Mountain Giant now, it's only a matter of time before that lone giant goes as well. Zephyrus is one of the coolest cards that they've ever released in Hearthstone, and I think it is perhaps a little bit too strong right now. I think it's just a bit too efficient at what it does, given that it only costs 2 mana to find you the perfect card. If I were to make a change to Zephyrus, which I think it needs a slight tweak, I think it's a little bit too strong. I'd just up it to like a 3 mana 3/3 or something like that. Maybe a 3 mana 3/2. 3 mana 3/2 probably a bit too much of a nerf. I think a 3 mana 3/3, just giving an extra mana cost to the card to make it a little bit harder to combo it with like Brawl and stuff, make it come down a turn later. I think would reduce the power level of the card, because it does feel a bit too strong right now. If you're ahead on board against a Reno deck, you do need to pile on the pressure onto them, and oftentimes you're just hoping they don't have a Zephyrus. So giving yourself an extra turn to worry less about Zephyrus Brawl, for instance, or other things like Zephyrus Death can sometimes be really strong. Zephyrus Silence, for instance. If you add an extra mana cost to the card, it's gonna lower the power level to a reasonable state, because right now I think the card is too strong. And finally, the card I think should probably be Hall of Famed, because it's been in Standard for far too long, is Leroy Jenkins. It's just been a finisher for aggro decks forever, pretty much. It's too efficient, I think, in what it does. And basically against rogues right now, they have a fair too many ways to abuse it, particularly Waggle Pick and Shadow Step. And there's so many games where I play and I'm like, well, I hope they don't have Leroy, otherwise I die. and there's nothing else I die to. It's just Leroy. It's like one card out of the entire deck, which I have to dodge, and it just happens like every game against an aggro deck where you're like, oh, I just hope they don't have this card. And it's just felt like that way for years and years and years, and I think the card just should be changed. They're already getting rid of charge damage from the game mostly. As you've seen, they're transitioning toward rush and stuff. And Leroy is kind of like the last remnant of OP charge cards still in standard. So I wouldn't be surprised if they were to get rid of Leroy at some point. I don't think you should nerf him. Making him 6 mana doesn't really make a whole lot of sense where there's things like Reckless Rocketeer in that mana cost. I think it's just better to Hall of Fame Leroy, and that way you're gonna be feeling like you're playing against different finishers from aggro decks. Against Zoo, for instance, if they're not playing a burst finisher, you can get down to a really low health total, and as long as you got board control, you can feel like you're not in danger of dying. Same thing with Priest, really. But these rogue decks, you pretty much have to heal up as well, because the threat of Leroy eventually killing you, and you have to counter pressure them and basically kill them before they kill you, because the burst damage is always going to be there, and Leroy is a big offender of it. So those are my suggested changes for upcoming Hearthstone balance changes. I'm sure I've forgotten a few, but those are the main ones which I think should be changed, and it will be a big enough of a change to have a drastic effect on the standard meta game, and hopefully for the better. My name is Jambre. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.